On June 11, 1891, a tiny notice measuring just 9 lines in length was published in a central Illinois newspaper called the Morrisonville Times. It was a report that by all rational measure should have overturned entire fields of science and rewritten human history. And yet it changed absolutely nothing. The day before that publication, a woman identified as Mrs. S. W. Culp had been engaged in the mundane chore of breaking apart coal to feed her household stove. A single chunk of anthracite fractured cleanly in two, and from the exact center of that lump a chain dropped out. It was made of gold, roughly 10 inches in total length. Its links were miniature, uniform, and entirely sealed. Every single ring was shut without any gap, without any solder, without any discernible mark of how it had been joined together. The two extremities of that chain were still held within the coal, one end in each half of the broken piece. The impression left by the chain was clearly visible in both fragments, link for link, exactly as if it had been a casting mould. The coal had not split along some old pre-existing fracture. It had broken fresh, and the chain had been inside material that originated during the Carboniferous period, approximately 300 million years ago. The newspaper published her name, her address, and the specific date of the occurrence. Culp showed her discovery to her neighbors, to her pastor, and to the editor of that very newspaper. The coal, they verified, had come from a local mine with a confirmed seam. That 9-line notice was printed and subsequently forgotten for an entire 130 years, but Culp was far from the only individual to make such a find. Across the subsequent 6 decades, 5 more people in 5 separate states split open anthracite and discovered metallic objects inside that had absolutely no justification for being there. Each discovery happened in a different decade, a different county, and was made by a different person who had never heard of any of the others, and each and every time that metal was an alloy that does not occur in nature and that no 19th century laboratory possessed the capability to synthesize. This is the complete account of all 6, presented in the chronological sequence of their discovery. The earliest chain was not Culp's at all. It had been found 23 years before her, in a mine that no longer exists. In the autumn of 1868, a crew was widening a lateral gallery in a deep anthracite mine near Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, when they broke through a coal wall at a depth of 600 feet. One of those miners, a man named Elias Schott, caught sight of a glint in the freshly exposed face of the coal. He pried the seam apart with a chisel and extracted a length of delicate chain approximately 8 inches long. Its links were so minute that at first glance the object looked like woven wire rather than individual loops, but under a hand lens each link was clearly distinct. A tiny, closed ring interlocked with its neighbors in a pattern that repeated without any variation from one end of the chain to the other. Schott carried it to the surface. The mine superintendent sent it to a professor of chemistry at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, roughly 40 miles to the south. That professor examined the chain over the course of several days and wrote a letter back to the superintendent, stating that the metal was a gold alloy of a type he had never before encountered, and that the quality of workmanship was unlike any known goldsmithing tradition, whether European or indigenous. He placed the chain in the university's official mineral collection. By the year 1890, however, it had vanished entirely. The collection log still shows the original entry, a fine gold chain, anthracite inclusion, Luzerne County, but there is no record of checkout, no transfer slip, no accession note explaining where it went. The entry simply ceases to continue, exactly the same way that the Academy of Natural Sciences entry for the Schuylkill County rod had stopped 40 years earlier. The pattern was already establishing itself before anyone even knew to search for it. 11 years after the Wilkes-Barre chain was found, a fireman named Hiram Beckley was breaking anthracite to feed a colliery steam engine in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. A chunk of coal split under his hammer, and a loop of metal dropped onto the iron grate. Beckley snatched it up before it could slide into the fire. It was a chain formed into a closed loop, roughly 6 inches in circumference. The links were heavier and wider than those that would later be uncovered in Morrisonville. One end of that loop carried a mechanism that Beckley described to the mine clerk as a clasp, 2 interlocking hooks that allowed the loop to be opened and closed. The presence of a clasp implies jewelry, jewelry implies a wearer implies a body. Beckley took the loop to a photographer in Pottsville, who made a single image of it laid against a white card. That photograph survived because it was included in a County Historical Society donation in 1923. It is still there today, in the Schuylkill County Historical Society archive, its catalogue number now illegible, filed under the heading of Miscellaneous Mining Curiosities. The loop itself was sent to the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, the very same institution that had received the metal rod from Schuylkill County back in 1847 and subsequently lost it. The Academy acknowledged receipt of the loop. A curator noted the object as a gold alloy loop, carboniferous coal matrix. No analysis was ever published. The object does not appear in any later catalogue. The Academy received two impossible objects from the exact same county 32 years apart, and managed to lose both of them. The photograph in Pottsville is the only physical evidence that the Schuylkill chain ever existed at all. In March of 1903, a blasting crew working in a coal mine in Kanawha County, West Virginia, opened a sealed pocket in a seam wall and found an object resting in a smooth cavity inside the coal. The foreman, a man named George Durst, extracted it with great care because he could see immediately that it was not stone. It was a chain, 14 inches long, the most finely crafted of the three found up to that point. What made it distinctly different from the Wilkes-Barre and Schuylkill chains was its pattern. The links alternated in size, a large oval, then a small round, then a large oval, repeating in a decorative sequence that was clearly intentional. This was not a functional chain, this was ornamental. It was designed to be seen and appreciated. Durst brought it to a chemist in Charleston named Rufus Landon, who tested a small filing from one link using standard assay techniques. Landon's report, which he shared with the Kanawha County Scientific Society in a presentation that April, described the metal as a gold alloy containing iridium and osmium in proportions he termed anomalous. Iridium and osmium are platinum group metals. They occur naturally but not alloyed with gold in any known deposit on Earth. Producing a gold-iridium alloy requires sustained temperatures above 2,400 degrees Celsius, roughly 1,000 degrees beyond the capacity of any forge or furnace that existed in the 19th century. Landon explicitly noted this. He noted further that the alloy did not match any commercial or industrial gold formulation he could identify. He asked the Smithsonian Institution to conduct a more detailed analysis. The Smithsonian acknowledged his letter. No analysis was ever published. Landon kept the chain in his home laboratory until his death in 1921. His estate records list his scientific instruments and specimens. The chain is not among them. In 1914, a miner named Josiah Coombs was working an expansion gallery at a depth of 800 feet in a coal mine in Harlan County, Kentucky, when his pick struck something that produced a ringing sound, not the dull thud of rock against metal, but a clear, resonant tone, the sound of a dense object receiving a sharp blow. He cleared the coal away from it with his bare hands. What he pulled out was a chain, but not like any of the others. It was short, just 5 inches long, and heavy. The links were thick and load-bearing, more like a fastening chain or a handle than a piece of jewelry. Each link was closed and seamless, just the same as every other chain on this entire list. Coombs did not send it to a university. He did not contact a scientific society. Instead, he cleaned it, ran a leather cord through it, and wore it as a watch fob for the next 20 years. His daughter later inherited it. His granddaughter donated it to the Southeast Kentucky Regional Museum in 1967, along with a handwritten note explaining precisely where it had come from. The museum accepted it, recorded its provenance, and placed it in storage. It has never been displayed. A museum volunteer who handled the donation in the 1990s told a local historian that the chain sat in a drawer marked with a label for coal mine artifacts, beside a collection of carbide lamp parts and a miner's lunch pail. Nobody had ever tested it. Nobody had ever photographed it. Nobody had looked at it since the day it went into that drawer. It is still there. Drawer 14, Building B, on a shelf beside a dead man's lunch pail. This is the most accessible piece of evidence on this entire list, and yet it is the one that has received the least amount of attention. The last chain was found in Indiana in a seam of lignite rather than anthracite. Lignite is younger coal from the tertiary period rather than the Carboniferous, roughly 50 million years old instead of 300 million. The find was made by a power plant worker named Harold Moss at a generating station near Clinton in Vermilion County. Moss was shoveling fuel from a delivery pile into a hopper when he noticed a glint in a cracked lump. He broke it open. Inside was the most delicate chain of all 6. It was 9 inches long, and each link was slightly different from the last, not uniform like the Wilkes-Barre chain, nor patterned like the Kanawha chain, but individually shaped, as though each ring had been formed by hand rather than by any repeating mechanical process. The overall effect was that of filigree. The chain looked like lace made of metal. Moss brought it to a metallurgist at Indiana State Teachers College in Terre Haute. That metallurgist, a man named Dr. Francis Howell, tested a small sample and found precisely the same thing that Rufus Landon had found in West Virginia 34 years earlier: gold, iridium, osmium, the exact same elements in the exact same ratio. Two chains, two different states, two different geological ages of coal, and the same alloy that no natural process produces and no 19th century laboratory could ever create. Howell wrote a letter to a colleague at Purdue University describing the result and noting the remarkable coincidence. He did not publish his findings. He did not contact the Smithsonian. By 1937, he had apparently heard enough about what happened whenever anomalous objects were sent to major institutions. That letter survives today in the Purdue University archives. The object itself was returned to Moss, who kept it in a cigar box in his garage. His family has not been located since. Gold is the simplest of all metals to identify and one of the most difficult to counterfeit. Its density, its color, its resistance to corrosion, and its melting point are all unique and unmistakable. An alloy of gold with iridium and osmium, however, is something else entirely. Iridium has a melting point of 2,446 degrees Celsius, the highest of any metal on the periodic table. Osmium melts at 3,033 degrees. To alloy either of these elements with gold requires sustaining temperatures that were simply not achievable outside of a laboratory setting until the development of the electric arc furnace in the early 20th century, and not at industrial scale until the 1930s. No forge, no crucible, no charcoal-fired kiln in any era before the modern age could produce temperatures sufficient to melt iridium into gold. The alloy is, in a literal and technical sense, impossible to produce before the 20th century, and yet two of the 6 chains, the Kanawha specimen from 1903 and the Vermilion specimen from 1937, tested positive for that exact same gold-iridium-osmium composition, analyzed independently by 2 different chemists 34 years apart in 2 different states. The other 4 chains were never tested at all. The Wilkes-Barre specimen disappeared from Lehigh University. The Schuylkill specimen disappeared from the Academy of Natural Sciences. The current location of the Morrisonville chain is completely unknown. The Harlan specimen sits untested in a museum drawer. 4 chains that could either confirm or deny the emerging pattern, and not one of them has ever been put under a spectrometer. The 2 that were tested showed the exact same fingerprint. The question is not what the alloy is. Landon identified it, and Howell confirmed it. The question is whether the remaining 4 carry that same signature, because if they do, then 6 objects found in 6 different states over a span of 70 years, in deposits ranging from 50 million to 300 million years old, were all made by the same process using the same recipe, and that means either someone manufactured gold-iridium-osmium chains across 300 million years of geological time, or all 6 chains were made at the same time by the same civilization and ended up in coal deposits of different ages for reasons that no current scientific model can possibly explain. 6 chains, 6 states, 7 decades. Illinois, Pennsylvania twice, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana. A housewife breaking anthracite for a stove, a miner 600 feet underground, a fireman feeding a steam engine, a blasting crew opening a sealed pocket, a pick striking something that rang with a clear tone, a power plant worker shoveling lignite. None of these people knew any of the others. None of them were looking for anything unusual. Each and every one of them was doing ordinary work on an ordinary day when a lump of carboniferous rock split open and something fell out that had been sealed inside since before the age of the dinosaurs. The institutional response was identical in every single case. Acknowledge the object if forced to do so. Decline to test it if at all possible. If tested, do not publish the results. If published, do not cite them. If cited, do not follow up. Let the object disappear into a collection, a drawer, a cigar box, an estate sale, and simply wait. The Academy of Natural Sciences received 2 objects from the same county and lost both. The Smithsonian was contacted twice and responded both times with complete silence. Lehigh University logged a chain and then could not account for its whereabouts. A museum in Kentucky accepted a chain and filed it away beside old lamp parts. The strategy was not to disprove. Disproving would require active engagement, and engagement would put the object on the official record in a way that could not be undone. The strategy was simply not to look, to classify without examining, to receive without testing, to store without displaying. And for 130 years that strategy worked perfectly, because the 6 chains were scattered across 6 different states in 6 different archives, and no one had ever lined them up and examined them all together. Until now, the Morrisonville Times for June 11, 1891 is still on file. The Schuylkill photograph is preserved in the County Historical Society. Landon's report to the Kanawha County Scientific Society exists in the Society's official minute book. Howell's letter is archived at Purdue. The Harlan chain is sitting in drawer 14 of Building B at a regional museum in southeastern Kentucky. Every single one of these finds left a paper trail behind it, and every one of those paper trails was designed to be the conclusion of the story. A 9-line notice in a small-town newspaper, a photograph filed under miscellaneous curiosities, a minute book that nobody ever reads, a letter between colleagues that was never published, a donation slip in a museum that does not display the object. The trails were small enough to be easily ignored and scattered enough to never intersect with one another. But they did not disappear. Paper does not forget. Archives do not decide what matters. They simply hold everything, and they hold it until someone walks in and asks the right question. The right question is not whether the chains are real. The newspaper confirms one. The photograph confirms another. The chemical analyses confirm 2 more. The museum drawer confirms a 5th. The right question is whether anyone will finally test the Harlan specimen, the one that is sitting in a building with a street address, in a drawer with a number accessible to anyone with proper credentials and a spectrometer. Because if that alloy matches, if the gold-iridium-osmium ratio in that drawer in Kentucky exact same ratio that Landon found in West Virginia and Howell found in Indiana, then the number is no longer 2. It becomes 3. And 3 identical alloys in 3 different states in deposits of 3 different geological ages is not an anomaly, it is a manufacturing signature. 6 chains, 2 tested, 1 accessible. The count is not closed.